So I said maybe I'd make a video on all the things and the little projects that I was working on during the summer. So let's have a look at that right now. One of the first things we want to look at is the actual desk I'm using. I built that not to be the highest quality piece of furniture, mind you. So I needed something that practically had enough desk space that I would have room for mixers, keyboards, whatever little thing I just needed some flat surface area for. I feel like I've got just about enough of it for what I'm doing here. The other thing I needed space for was rack-mounted equipment. And so I've got on either side of kind of the main driver's seat, I've got 4 spaces each, 4 rack spaces, just for kind of the stuff that I want immediately at hand. So, for example, to my right, I have a Samson C control unit that I use just as a speaker and input controller. That's actually kind of functioning as my primary master mixer right now, because the Behringer 24-channel mixer that's sitting on the desk right now doesn't seem to want to cooperate. In fact, none of my Behringers want to cooperate right now. And it might just because they're old and used and everything dies, right? So right now they're mostly sitting there to discourage the cat from wandering around up here and knocking over something more valuable. So we've got that going on. And I also put my power conditioner and just basically anything I want direct access to. Right now I don't have a lot of outboard gear that I really have a crying need to get at other than that speaker controller. So it's just a matter of where I think things should be right now. But as I get more outboard gear and start experimenting with what I feel like I need and what I don't need and what kind of workflow situation I'm getting in, that will more or less determine where things go. Then I built two sidecars to go along with it. And one of them serves as what I like to call the recording chunk, which basically has the audio interface and anything that needs to be directly patched into it. I don't have it on its own power brick right now. So I could probably simplify this sidecar by adding a power strip, giving it its own power strip to plug the gear into. Then it would only need a few minor connections. There's also some audio connections that have to go out to the speaker controller, but it's kept to a dull roar. If there's a lot of interconnects between units, I'm trying to keep them all to the same car. The other sidecar is serving probably its most important job right now, which is to hold up the coffee machine, because you can't record or produce anything without coffee. It's a little known fact within the entertainment industry that if there's no coffee, there is no content. So, but in the meantime, that's what it's doing. It's also, I'm planning on making that the kind of my main bus cabinet. So basically my best 2 compressors and my best 2 EQs go in there so that the final 2-channel results of whatever it is I'm putting together can be pumped through that for the final sweetening on its way towards public gold. So, or not, who knows? I don't want to get too full of myself, right? But yeah, that's the plan, is the best compressors and the best EQ can go in that cabinet. And then below there I've got some storage shelves for microphones and any other little doodads. I try to keep it studio related. So, I mean, if there's model railroad gear, it doesn't get stored in that cabinet. I want to keep that to microphones and electronics. So another item of interest that I've been working on are drum kits. Now, the plan, this is a plan I've been working on for, we might be going on a decade now. But what it involves is taking some of my older drum kits where I think the shells are thrashed or the sizes are not quite what I want it to be for that setup. Rather than replacing them with entirely new drum kits, just replacing the parts that are bugging me. So in one case, I actually took my very first drum kit that I got when I was 10 years old. It was a 4-piece Fibes Coda outfit, which had the 9x13 rack tom, a 16x16 floor, and a 14x22 inch bass drum. And the snare drum that came with that kit was a 5x14 Gretsch round badge, maybe chrome over brass or steel. I don't know which. but it does have a round Gretsch badge with like the antique bronze finish looking on it. So I still have that snare drum, and I've never gotten rid of that kit. But the original fiberglass shells were just destroyed. They had had so many holes drilled into them, so many experiments performed on them. The finish was trashed. Basically, restoring them wasn't really a practical idea, and I wasn't necessarily interested in having. I'm not a purist when it comes to having a Fibes drum kit. I'm more of a purist. I'm more of a sentimentalist, actually, about that particular drum kit because it was my first kit. The plan on that was, well, we'll just replace the shells with maple shells. We'll modernize the hardware because the mounting hardware and the bass drum spurs and all that stuff was pretty terrible on there. So, yeah, let's just do kind of a resto mod on that kit. So originally I was going to buy a bunch of new Keller shells, get some new wrap, and just redistribute the lugs as needed. I kind of did the math on how many lugs I had, how many lugs I needed to do such and such range of shell sizes, and it was going to cost maybe $500-600 to pull off, and which ain't bad for basically having what amounts to a new drum kit. Instead, I decided, in the spirit of waste not, want not that seems to permeate my activities here, is I had another rebuilding project that required that I take the hardware off of those shells. And the shells were just sitting around. I pilfered that hardware when we were still living in the old place. But I saved the shells because I was like, the drums that I took that hardware from, when they were all together, they sounded really good. So I thought those shells might be worth hanging on to. And I ended up just doing a minor amount of re-drilling and relocating the Fibes hardware onto those shells. By the way, it's worth mentioning the sizes on these drums with the new shell configuration: 8x10, 12x14, and the bass drum is now an 18x22. The results are pretty favorable. In one instance, my Fibes kit never looked or sounded so good. And I also upgraded a few things. Like I said, I upgraded things like spurs and mounting brackets and what have you. Other thing I did was I got rid of the original Fibes flathead lug mounting screws. The big problem with those being, number one, they're too short. The fiberglass shells were a good deal thinner than maple shells, and the old screws just weren't going to be long enough to do the job. Not to my sense of satisfaction or security anyway. So I actually replaced those, and I don't like flathead screws. I replaced them instead with Allen screws. Really, really nice stainless steel Allen screws that were plenty long enough to get through both a maple shell and engage the lug hardware itself without pulling out or being not far enough in there. I feel like I got a good strong connection. Put some appropriate fender washers on there, and it's really, I'm really pleased with how the kit went together. And I had one extra shell left over. I had a 7x8 tom-tom shell, and I wasn't sure what to do with it because it was a Pacific drum. All of these were Pacific drums, and their hardware spacing is, I think, 1 3/8 from mounting hole to mounting hole. I couldn't find a commercial lug that would fit naturally into there except for those oversized imitation Camco lugs, and I'm not going to do that. And I needed something I had on hand. It turns out this old 10-inch Slingerland tom-tom that I had, I was going to take it apart anyway, so I decided to take the 12 lugs off of that, put it on the 8-inch tom-tom, and so now I have a little 8-inch add-on tom that sort of matches the Fibes kit. And the Fibes lugs, if I had 12 more Fibes lugs, they wouldn't fit on that 8-inch tom-tom shell because the lugs are actually pretty large. So ultimately, I think the Slingerlands are just a better fit for a drum that small. I want to talk about this snare drum before we wrap this up. Now, I said that was also my first snare drum. When I was in high school, I got it into my head I was going to put a band together with guys that had black guitars with white pick guards on them. They were both Fender guitars. And so with that inspiration in mind, I was going to paint my snare drum with a black shell with white hardware. And it came out okay, but I was in high school and using spray cans. So I'll leave it to your imagination just what the quality of the finish was on that snare drum. And then later I thought, when the Rush Counterparts album came out, I think in 93, 94, When the Counterparts album came out, I thought, well, Neil Peart seems to be changing the color of his drum kit every time an album comes out. What if he does blue shells with black hardware? Wouldn't that be cool? Well, of course, Neil didn't do anything like that. Um, but I did. I was like, well, screw it. I got that snare drum. I've already ruined it by painting it once. Let's try it out. So I had some blue paint and I had some black paint. So I made it a blue shell with black hardware. And so that's the way it sat for the rest of the time in the Navy and coming back here, and 2 decades go by. And I dig this thing out and I'm like, I really should try to fix this thing. And it turned out that a particular brand of paint stripper worked a treat on metal parts like that. And so I stripped all the paint off of that, and to my delight, I discovered that I did not sand the metal before I painted it when I was in high school, which meant that there was a whole pile of shiny chrome underneath all that paint. And the only thing that got scuffed up were the original Gretsch snare drum hoops, which frankly could probably stand to be replaced anyway. And the original Gretsch strainer is nowhere to be found. So in terms of, again, another drum like trying to get it back to original collector's condition, not that interested. It's more, again, sentimental value, and to have the thing back in, it's actually in better shape than when I first got it. I also built some photography lights using some cheap LED fixtures and some drum hardware, just because it is kind of dank down here without good lighting, and I felt that was something that needed to be addressed and could be done quite quickly. So yeah, I figured I could take the cheaper option rather than spending several $100s on dedicated studio lighting in a place that I'm renting. That didn't seem to make a lot of sense. But cheap fluorescent fixtures, and they're not even fluorescents, they're LEDs. Cheap LED fixtures on drum hardware and microphone stands seems to be a pretty viable solution, and it's not hurting my eyes right now. Alright, another thing I'd like to talk about is my computer. Now, this thing right here, it has a nickname right now. That nickname is Steve Buscemi. The reason I call it that is because it's basically an old CPU on an old motherboard with old RAM sitting in a brand new case with new RGB fans, a new graphics card, a new power supply, and a USB 3 card. So it's kind of like, it just made me think of that meme of the how do you do, fellow students? Like, I cobbled it together using the best available cast-off parts from the various computer builds that have been going on around this house. And while I'm still waiting for parts for my primary computer build, which I'm calling the Mint Machine, I'll get into that later as I start making videos about the progress of that. I decided to make some improvements to my old computer just to at least get it to hang on, frankly. I mean, the original computer that started with is over 10 years old. And the vast majority of the hardware from that thing is now getting ready to be turned into a NAS. So I have somewhere to put all the video footage that I'm planning on shooting. But until then, I needed just something to be a good daily driver while I'm more or less in between computers. And the Steve Buscemi meme over there is serving that purpose nicely. I was trying to hang on to the original Windows 7 installation as well, but when I changed the motherboards, there's apparently a procedure you need to go through in the BIOS before you do that little maneuver, and the OS didn't like the change in motherboards and basically told me where to go. So I ended up having to install Windows 10 on there, which I was trying to avoid because I wasn't sure how it would play with the older hardware that I have and the older software that I have in terms of audio production. Could I still use my licensed copy of Cubase on there and stuff like that? So ultimately I got all those things to work, or I'd be pitching a fit right now. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that poor little computer, and eventually I want to make some videos about building not so much its replacement. I mean, it will be replaced eventually. But I want to do a little bit of content about fiddling with computers and getting inside them. Not totally Linus Tech Tips or Jay's 2 cents, but just sort of, hey, I do this, I like doing this kind of stuff too, so I'm going to share a little bit of it with you as I progress forward on that. So anyway, that should wrap up the kind of studio tour slash what did I do this summer, why wasn't I making model railroad videos, question project slash object. So yeah, now I get to cut all this together. Hope you all enjoyed it. See you next time with some model railroad content.